Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Esri GeoDev webinar series. About 2 years ago, we started this series as a way to continue engaging in developer-related topics and discussions in between Dev Summits. And speaking of which, we have our next Developer Summit coming up in Berlin, November 6th through 8th. We have a lot of new topics, advanced features, and additional functionality to share with you over the next coming months. So be sure to stay connected with us through our GeoDev webinar series page on go.esri.com/geodev or any of our social media accounts at Esri GeoDev. We would love to have conversations like these taking place throughout the year so that when we do meet at one of these Dev Summit conferences, it will be as though we never stopped. We hope you get as much or more out of this webinar than you anticipated. Now, we would like to introduce you to today's webinar, Security Considerations for Web GIS. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in your upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default, but if you'd like to join over the phone, just select Use Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and then address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Bill Major and Jeff Smith, product engineers at Esri. Bill, let's get started, shall we?
Okay, everyone can hear me okay? Jeff and Amy, is everything good?
Yes.
Yep, everything sounds good.
Okay, just wanted to get a sound check. My name is Bill Major. I'm a developer on the ArcGIS Enterprise team, and I've spent a number of years doing a lot of security and SSL work in many customer cases. Jeff?
My name is Jeff Smith. I'm a product engineer on the ArcGIS Enterprise team, and I too focus predominantly on security features, authentication, SSL, that type of stuff.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to talk about configuring SSL properly in a ArcGIS Enterprise implementation. Jeff's going to spend some time talking about identity stores in ArcGIS Enterprise and how to configure them and give you some good demos there. And then we're going to wrap up with some best practices, a few of the best practices that you should consider just to improve the security posture of your ArcGIS Enterprise installation. So the first thing that we want to just take a step back and talk about what is secure communication, encrypted and trusted communication. And really what we're talking about here is this term SSL or HTTPS. All of those are referred to secure communication. SSL stands for Secure Socket Layer, and it's been a standard around for many years by which encryption occurs between a client and a server, or in this case, maybe a web browser and a web server. Although we use the term SSL quite a bit still these days, the actual latest protocol is TLS at version 1.2. So that is the most up-to-date, most secure protocol that's used for encrypted communication. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about, how does certificates work? So at the essence of SSL certificates are what we call certificate authorities. You may know some certificate authorities such as VeriSign, DigiCert, Let's Encrypt is a popular one right now because it's free, and GoDaddy and some different ones like that. So these are all well-known trusted certificate authorities from which you can actually get, typically through purchasing, signed server certificates. Now, some organizations on disconnected environments or within internal networks, they have their own established certificate authorities internal, so they may not use external certificate authorities. But wherever your certificate authorities are, or whichever ones you use, that's how you get SSL certificates. And there's a fun website here we'll look at in a moment, but it just allows you to type in an address and it will go interrogate the SSL certificate at that site and provide you some information about it. And this is at the heart of the public key infrastructure, PKI, Encryption is always about a public key and a private key, and I'll mention that here a little bit more to explain how that works. So let's just review for a moment the concept of a certificate authority. So certificate authorities via a certificate signing request basically will sign a certificate that then you can use on your server. Certificate authorities typically will issue server certificates, but they also can issue client certificates. I know many of our users are starting to use user PKI certificates more for authentication, and those too can come from certificate authorities. Okay. Now, one other thing to note is many times there are chains of certificate authorities that include intermediates. Sometimes you may see the term subordinates certificates used. So just be aware that when you're looking at chains of SSL certificates, many times you'll see not only the CA root, but intermediate authorities and potentially subordinate and other lower level authorities as well. But whatever that is, the process is ultimately that certificate authority signs a server certificate, and then that whole chain is trusted from there. So I just wanted to talk for a moment about, well, how does encrypted communication actually occur? Some of you may know this, some of you may not. So at the end of the day, let's say that a certificate authority, you're an IT admin, you get a signed certificate for your web server, as seen here on the left-hand side. On this server, think of a SSL certificate as really having two pieces. This concept of a private key and a public key. Okay, both of those together make a signed certificate. Now, when a browser, for example, or a client on the right-hand side makes a request to this server, the browser says, "Hey, I want to talk to you over SSL." The server says, "Okay, if you want to do that, then I'm going to give you my public key, and it's up to you to decide if you trust this or not." And so the client will basically get that server, that public key back as part of the exchange. And if the client has the full trusted chain of the certificate authorities that signed that server certificate, then proper trust is initiated and you get a nice little check mark on your web browser. If it doesn't trust it, either because it's expired or it's self-signed, or you don't have those root certificates in your browser, that's when you get the web browser many times of, hey, you're going to an untrusted site. Do you really want to proceed? And you have to do some extra clicks to make that happen. But also, I just wanted to highlight, how the private and public key works. Once the client decides that it will trust this certificate, it uses the public key to actually then encrypt traffic back to the server, and only the server's private key can decrypt that traffic. So that's why it's very, very important to protect the private key in these scenarios. The public key you give out to whoever you want, because that's what they're going to use to encrypt, but only your private key can decrypt that traffic. So how do you set up communication? Typically, when you first install a web server right out of the box, whether it's Windows IIS or Tomcat or Apache, it doesn't have SSL enabled by default, and many organizations mandate that these days that you don't serve out any web traffic over port 80 any longer, and more importantly, they really want you to have signed, nice signed certificates. So when you, like I said, when you first set up a web browser, you need to get your certificate, and then you need to have a CA sign it, and then put that on your web server and enable that 443 binding. So no matter whether you're using IIS or something more command line like Tomcat or Apache, the process is a little bit the same. You create what we call a certificate signing request. That is then passed to your certificate authority. You get it back, and then you configure your web server from there. You basically tell IIS, hey, here's the SSL certificate that I'm going to use, or on the Tomcat side, you're saying, hey, here's a location of my certificate to use for serving up SSL. And then at the end of the day, you get a nice little lock when you go to a web server like that. So I just want to pause for a moment, and I'm going to bring over a web browser here. So this is the SSL shopper slash SSL checker. It's kind of cool. You can just type in any address, and what it will do is actually go out and interrogate that URL and get information about the SSL certificate. So you can see when it's going to expire, who issued it, and just some information like that. So that's just a fun little tool just to make sure that a server certificate is good to go. One other thing I just want to highlight is, I go to the Esri homepage, for example, and you can see I have a nice little lock here. That means everything is good. It means the certificate is valid. I trust it. I trust the chain, the certificate authorities that signed the certificate. And if you didn't know this, you can actually click on that little lock and go look at the certificate for this web server. You can see the common name of who it was issued to, how long it's good for, who it was issued by. You can actually see that certificate path. So not only DigiCert root, but there's a GeoTrust intermediate in there. And you can double click on these guys, and you can open each one of those certificates individually. And think of these as sort of the public key portion of certificates. This is what gets handed out, and anyone can view these aspects of it. The other thing that's very important to look at on a certificate is the subject alternative names. So generally, when you get a SSL certificate, you get it issued in the name through which the URL that browsers will be hitting that web server. This could be very different from the machine name or something like that. This is the URL that your clients are going to be hitting the web server by, typically maybe a DNS alias or something like that. But you can also provide subject alternative names on the certificate that basically says, hey, this certificate can also be valid for any of these other names as well. So as you can see here, this certificate can be used for a number of different ways that Esri has gotten this certificate. And we also support wildcard certificates. So, in theory, you could have a DNS name that says star.esri.com, and that certificate could be used for any esri.com web server, and we actually support that. So one of these subject alternative names is also esriuk.com, and if we go look at that certificate, you can see that it's actually the exact same certificate, on a different URL being used on a different web server. But again, it was one of these subject alternative names here in the list, and it's perfectly valid for that URL as well. So that's just a little information about certificates. Be aware of the URL, make sure it's the common name or one of the SANs or the subject alternative names, and you should be good to go. So I'm going to get back into my slideshow here. Sorry about that, jump back a little bit. So now we've talked briefly about the web server, what SSL is, kind of how it works. I'm just going to quickly now talk about how you can implement some SSL improvements down into the ArcGIS Enterprise stack. So this is just a diagram, I'm not going to go through it in detail, but in a very small implementation of Enterprise, you have many SSL touch points, from the client to the web server, from the web server talking to portal, depending on what type of web tier authentication you may have, it may be talking to a secure LDAP. You got ArcGIS servers in play. So there's many touch points that you have to really understand how requests are flowing through your system, how they're flowing out of your system to other service endpoints, and making sure you get SSL configured properly. One of the first things you always want to do, as I mentioned a while ago, is first get your web server properly secured with a good signed certificate. This is where your web adapters will typically be deployed. So your clients are coming in to a server, they get a good signed certificate, then the web adapter is routing traffic on the back end to your server and portal. Clients typically would never need to directly hit 6443 or 7443. So from a secure communication perspective, this is always the first thing you want to do, almost definitely in production environments. Typically in development environments, people tend to use self-signed certificates, which is fine as well. But at the end of the day, using signed certificates is the best way to make sure things are working properly. So with Portal and ArcGIS Server and Data Store and some other server types such as GeoEvent, Notebook Server, and some other things out there, they all have ports serving out SSL ports, 7443, 6443, 11443 for Notebook Server. And when you install these pieces of software, these ports are enabled with a self-signed certificate. The web server piece of it has to come up, and in order to come up on SSL, it has to have a certificate in place. We're not going to guess it, or give you a signed certificate. So we create self-signed certificates on each one of these ports, so that the web server pieces can come up. One thing to be aware is that new installs starting at 10.7 and beyond, many of the ArcGIS enterprise components are going to be in HTTPS only mode on install. ArcGIS Server, for example, previously was HTTP and HTTPS, but now at 10.7 moving forward on fresh installs, everything will be HTTPS only. So that 6080 port won't be enabled by default any longer on new installs. So just be aware of that. So if you want to update the internal certificate, so if these self-signed certificates, some organizations will say, from a security perspective, we don't want self-signed certificates at all on our network. We want signed certificates. So we actually provide admin APIs that allow you to go in and update those self-signed certificates with certificates that are signed. So for example, in the Portal admin API, you can go to security SSL certificates, and you can import an existing server certificate like a PFX or something like that, and allow you to import that certificate and then get it set up so that that certificate will then start to be used on that 7443 port. The same thing with ArcGIS Server. If you wanted to replace the self-signed certificate that it comes with, then you can also import a server certificate. If it's a multi-node site, just be aware that you have to do this on each machine in order to get the certificates in place correctly for each machine.
Now, Bill, sorry to interrupt here, but I had a quick question for you that I hear a lot of people ask. You're talking about importing the certificates in this case in a multi-node site. Say I've got 4 machines for my ArcGIS server. Can I import the same certificate into each machine?
That's a great question, Jeff. Actually, the answer always is it depends a little bit. But in this situation, if you had a signed certificate that had either a wildcard that could represent, the name or URL of each one of those machines, or a certificate with all 4 machines listed as subject alternative names, you could very well use that same certificate for each one of those machines.
Okay, thanks.
Does that answer your question? Very good. Okay. So that's about replacing the self-signed certificates. Another thing that you need to be thinking about is, well, if my server or portal need to reach out to other services or service endpoints, then you need to make sure that you import the proper trust, let me just say, like the certificate authorities of these other servers, their certificates, so that these machines can reach out and talk to them without having any SSL errors. All right, so this is about establishing trust for external communication of your enterprise environment reaching out. And you do that through importing the root and intermediate certificates for these. Some examples of this is if I have creating a web map and I have it talking to an external map service, some external web service that's not within my control, and it's using some signed certificate that I may not be familiar with, and you can get that certificate and import it so that the map service works correctly, or even thumbnails are generated properly. And of course, in Portal for ArcGIS, there's the importing of root and intermediate links there. If you click on that, it'll ask you to browse to a file. You can import that. You can see in my list there, I have Esri root, for example. That's just the internal certificate authority I've imported. And the same thing works for ArcGIS Server as well. There's an import root or intermediate. Just one other thing, when you're down in these admin APIs looking at some of this information, there are other types of configurations you can apply. Like I said, by default, SSL protocols now are TLS version 1.2 only. If you had a need to relax or control that or add more protocols to that list, you're welcome to do that, as long as you understand the security impacts of that. And if you're really down and understand how cipher suites work in terms of how encryption actually works, you can actually go in and change the different cipher suites that are accepted by Portal and ArcGIS Server when it's trying to communicate. So that's all for me on the first set of slides here. Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you talk about some authentication.
All right, thanks, Bill. Can you see my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Let me get this going. All right, as Bill discussed with the encryption, that's important. What's also important is authentication. Authentication is identifying who is logging in to your ArcGIS Enterprise site. Now, I want to discuss today several options that we've got for authentication: the portal tier, the web tier, and the SAML authentication. Each of these options works great, but there are certain scenarios where one might be preferable to the other based on some different factors. We'll take a look into that. And that's what we want to consider here is who will be accessing your ArcGIS Enterprise. In other words, are these going to be internal users within your organization? Are these going to be contractors who don't have enterprise accounts within your organization, or are these going to be just the public with random accounts? Who's going to be accessing it? From where will the users be accessing it? Again, are they all going to be accessing them, the site internally within your local intranet, or are some of them going to be perhaps off-site and field workers accessing through the internet or through a mobile device? Different things to consider here. And what's also important is where your ArcGIS Enterprise is deployed. Are you going to keep it internally inside your local intranet, your enterprise environment, or are you going to deploy it to the cloud so it can be publicly accessible? Different considerations. So first, portal tier authentication. Portal tier authentication allows you to use enterprise users. It communicates with Active Directory or LDAP users. And what's great about portal tier authentication is it supports both built-in and enterprise users. You don't have to go in and select one or the other. You'll just log in at the sign-in window, and I'll give you some examples here shortly of that. The configuration steps, you just need to configure your ArcGIS Enterprise to communicate directly with your enterprise identity store, whether that's Active Directory or LDAP. You also need to consider whether you want users to be added automatically, and for portal tier authentication specifically, you need to configure your web adapter to allow anonymous access. And I'll show you what I mean here. It's a little bit, could be a little confusing, since obviously we need to authenticate. We don't want to allow just an anonymous user, but I'll show you here shortly here. I've got a couple of screenshots in the portal administrator directory. Under properties, you can choose whether you want to enable the automatic account creation. Likewise, the user store configuration and group store configuration need to be set. In this case, when the type is Windows, it means it's communicating with Active Directory. So you can see a sample JSON string right here. And what I was mentioning to you about the web adapter, you need to enable anonymous authentication. So let me, before I give you an example, let's talk about when you would use this. Oftentimes this is great if your web server's in the DMZ. In other words, you're unable to configure the web server to allow web tier authentication, and you want to allow users, both enterprise users and non-enterprise users or ArcGIS users, to be able to log in. And again, like I've said before, this enables both built-in and enterprise users to log in. Very similar to SAML. The big disadvantage of portal tier authentication is you do not get the single sign-on experience. In other words, you access your ArcGIS enterprise site, you have to type in your username and password each time. It doesn't just automatically sign you in. So let me give you a quick demo here. So I've got right here my ArcGIS enterprise site configured just with built-in users. And I'm going to log into my portal administrator directory. And under security config, we've got I'm going to update the identity store. And for the user store configuration, I'll paste in the JSON string for that. Now what this is doing, this is going to configure my ArcGIS Enterprise to communicate with Active Directory. I'll update the configuration. And I will also, in this case, enable automatic account creation. Again, it's up to you depending on the number of licenses you have, whether you would want to do this in your environment. For this demo, it will be easier to do it this way. And within IIS, Portal is my web adapter right here. Under authentication, I've got anonymous access enabled and everything else disabled. We'll come back to this shortly when I show you the web tier authentication. But now, if I log out of here and access my ArcGIS Enterprise site again, I can go in and I can log in with an enterprise user. And it looks like it's just an ArcGIS login. It looks like it's a built-in account. It doesn't look any different, but when I sign in, that is going out and communicating with Active Directory and verifying the user is correct, authenticating the user through Active Directory, and the account was created automatically here, and I'm signed in. All right. So, web tier authentication. All right, with web tier authentication, I'm going to talk predominantly with the web adapter installed in IIS. That means we're authenticating through the web adapter. Similar authentication can be done if you're using a Java-based web adapter on Tomcat. But for this demo and for this discussion, I'll stick with IIS. It's very common in a Windows environment, and of course, the key factor that most users like about it is it enables the single sign-on experience. What that means, you come into your computer in the morning, you log in once. When you access your ArcGIS Enterprise site through your browser, you're automatically signed in. You don't have to type in your credentials again to log into ArcGIS Enterprise. In fact, in theory, you would never have to type in your credentials once you've logged into your computer for the first time in the morning. Again, this is ideal if most of your users are within your local intranet. It doesn't work so well for external users. The credentials aren't going to be sent automatically, and you'd have to type in your credentials anyways. It does support PKI authentication. I'll get into that shortly, but the PKI allows you to use smart cards or client certificates instead of having to worry about a username or password. Configuration steps, it's very similar to the portal tier authentication. We need to configure ArcGIS Enterprise to communicate with Active Directory. We need to determine if enterprise users will be added automatically. And the final step is to configure the web adapter to handle the authentication. In other words, we need to tell the web adapter, we need to enable the Windows authentication on the web adapter and disable the anonymous access. That's the big difference here between the web tier authentication and portal tier authentication. So if I jump back to here, I'm going to sign out as this user. So I'm not signed in here. I'm going to go into, I've already got my portal administrator directory configured with the identity store. I'm not going to touch that. The only change I'm going to make here is within IIS, I'm going to disable the anonymous access and enable the Windows authentication. It doesn't require a restart, doesn't require anything. I'm just going to refresh this page, and I don't even get prompted for a username and password here. I'm logged in. That's me. That's my enterprise account. That's great. So now, one thing to keep in mind, certainly in this scenario, I don't have the option to sign out. Since it's web tier authentication, once I'm signed in, that's who I'm signed in as. I can't potentially log out and log back in as another user in this scenario. So now with PKI authentication, or with PKI, it's another level of web tier authentication. Again, it's supported with Active Directory and LDAP. The only difference here, you've got the web tier authentication enabled, just like you've seen in my previous demo. But in this case, we're going to require clients to submit certificates. This is similar. The certificates are not, they're not the same certificates that Bill was just explaining for your server certificates. Those certificates are used to identify the web server where they're installed on. These client certificates are used to identify individuals. Another example, like smart cards or CAC cards, are another form of these sort of PKI or client certificates. So the only difference here, and I can show you in this as well, let me exit out. Within IIS, we've done everything here, web tier authentication. Everything's configured fine. The only change we need to make is under SSL settings. I need to require SSL, and I need to require client certificates right here. I apply this, and again, no restart is required. I go out, I refresh this page. In my browser, since I have multiple certificates within my Firefox, I get a drop-down list of which certificate I want to use. I can use my own. I've got a couple of other sample ones here. I'll use my own in this case. And then from this point forward, it responds just like web tier authentication, very similar to the single sign-on experience. Now, finally, before we do that, I want to disable this, because for the demo, the next demo is going to be for SAML. And I need to have that disabled here. All right. Now, a very popular form of authentication is SAML. What's ideal about SAML? Well, first of all, SAML, in a lot of cases, your organization already has a SAML identity provider. For organizations that utilize Office 365, Office 365 uses SAML to authenticate its users. If you already have that, if you're already using that in your environment, then it's very easy to configure ArcGIS Enterprise to use that same SAML identity provider. You've got a little more flexibility with SAML with the username format. You can enable multi-factor authentication. It does support both built-in and enterprise users. In that case, it's similar to the portal tier authentication. But in this case, it can be accessed externally. If your ArcGIS Enterprise is deployed in the cloud, SAML is a great form of authentication, very popular to be used there. And enterprise groups are also supported using SAML. That was started in release 10.6. So just a quick sort of conceptual workflow of how SAML works. A benefit from using SAML is the fact that ArcGIS Enterprise does not ever need to communicate directly with the identity provider. That's why it works in a cloud environment. You've got your identity provider stored internally in your own environment. Your ArcGIS Enterprise is deployed in the cloud. The client is the one that needs to be able to communicate with both of them. ArcGIS Enterprise never has to communicate directly. So in this case, the user attempts to log in. ArcGIS Enterprise redirects them back to the identity provider. The identity provider sends the user logs into the identity provider, and a SAML response is sent back to the browser, which is then forwarded back on to the ArcGIS Enterprise. And that response, the ArcGIS Enterprise is able to decrypt that response, validate who that user is, and assign permissions accordingly, and verify that the user is logged in. So to set up SAML, this is done instead of going through the portal administrator directory. This is actually done through the organization settings security page, and I'll give you a demo shortly of this. In this case, you would set the enterprise login, and you'd specify some advanced settings here, and I can discuss some of these shortly. Once the SAML identity provider is configured, when you log into your ArcGIS Enterprise site, you're given the option of choosing Enterprise Logon, which would redirect you to your SAML identity provider here, or you could choose the ArcGIS Logon, where you would use your built-in accounts. So let me give you a quick demo of that. First, I need to go out here and clear the cache in my browser since it still thinks I'm logged in. Perfect. All right, now I will sign in as an administrator here. And under settings, like I said, this is settings and security. If we scroll down a little bit here, we've got enterprise logins via SAML. Now you do have an option, one identity provider or a federation of identity providers. This gets beyond what we're going to discuss today, but there are certain identity providers where you could get multiple ones work together to log in via SAML. But like I said, that's we're not going to go over that today. So I'm going to set the enterprise logon. I can give it any name I want. I'll choose ADFS in this case. And I will have my users log in automatically. The metadata from the enterprise identity provider, in some cases, your IT administrator might provide you with an XML file with this metadata, or you can access this through a URL. It's a little easier if you have the URL. It's a little easier that way, so I'll stick with that. And under Show Advanced Settings, these settings are specific to the identity provider that you're using. In this case, in this example, I'm using the Microsoft ADFS, or Active Directory Federation Service. There are a couple of, the ADFS requires a signed request using SHA-256 in order for it to allow logouts to propagate. That's just unique to ADFS. So I will check those, and I will enable the SAML-based group membership. Just as a demo here, this can stay blank. That looks fine. I click Set Identity Provider. Now the next step is to do a Get Service Provider. When I click on this, all I get is another XML file. I save the XML file, and what I need to do is provide that XML file to my IT administrator to import into the enterprise identity store. It's a way of setting up a two-way trust between your ArcGIS enterprise site and the enterprise identity provider. In this case, I've already done that, so I will click Save here. And now I will sign out as an administrator. Click Sign In. And again, like I showed in the slides, I've got two options here. The enterprise login or the ArcGIS login. If I select the enterprise login, then I get redirected to the login window, and I will log in as a new user here. And I'm redirected back to my ArcGIS Enterprise, logged in as that user. So again, this is very popular in cloud environments, since the ArcGIS Enterprise site does not need to establish direct communication with the enterprise identity provider. And with that, I will go ahead and pass this back over to Bill.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Just a quick check, you can see my screen, is that correct?
Yes, I can see
Okay.
it.
That was a lot of great info. Hopefully you get, yeah, that's really neat, some of the different configurations that we can do there. All right, I'm just going to spend our remaining time briefly going over some best practices that you should be aware of. So first and foremost, this is just a reiteration. Make sure that you're always running everything in HTTPS only. I mentioned that at 10.7, new installs are HTTPS only. But if you're upgrading from a existing version, then especially with ArcGIS Server, like the example is here, you might still be in the HTTP and HTTPS only mode. So that may be something you want to double check. Make sure you're always HTTPS. Of course, you can go into the admin API and configure that as you need to. One of the things that's very easy or very convenient for many of us developers, many of you who probably on the line today, is sometimes you want to like figure out what services on an ArcGIS server REST endpoint, go look at what fields are there and some different pieces of information like that. Well, if you think about that in a production environment, you may not want people to randomly be browsing your services endpoint, especially if they have access to it or can get access to it. So one of the things you can do is actually disable the REST services directory on your ArcGIS server. And by doing so, then when people try to go to REST services, they're going to get a 403 error. So this doesn't turn off the REST API itself, just that HTML representation of the REST endpoint, so that it's not easily browsable and you can see a lot of the information there. So the way you do that is you actually go into the admin API. There's a services directory enabled, and you can actually check and turn that guy off. So that's how you would disable the service directory in ArcGIS Server. Another thing that's very a lot of developers, web developers, need to think about today are CORS requests. Do you want different applications to be able to make requests to your ArcGIS server from a web server or web client that did not initiate that original request? So this is what a CORS request is. If I go to a web server to get an application, and then part of that JavaScript code says, oh, go over here to a different web server and load a map. Now by default, some of this cross origin requests are allowed, but you may want to actually restrict that so that it can't be used in this capacity. So again, with ArcGIS Server, you can go into the admin API under the REST services directory, and by default, the allowed origins, I believe, is set to star, which means basically allow anyone or anything. But you can go in and put in very specific domain URLs to restrict the access that requests can be made to your services endpoint. This is a super cool tool. Actually, Jeff Smith helped write this, or did write it. There's a server scan Python tool. So this is installed with your ArcGIS server installation. It's been there for a few releases. We got good help on it, which we'll look at in a moment. But if you install ArcGIS server, then you can run this Python tool, and it generates a report of various security findings. So you can use this report to improve the stance of your enterprise, of your site, whether it be there will be critical findings, important or recommended. So you pick and choose what things that you may want to improve upon. So let's talk about Portal just for a moment. As I mentioned, it is in HTTPS only as well at 10.7. It's checked on. I would say leave it there. Don't check that off from a security perspective. You can also disable the REST or the sharing API HTML view of things. So if you're familiar with ArcGIS /sharing/REST, then you can easy enough go in there and disable that. so that it is not easily traversable from an HTML perspective. So when you were to go to the sharing endpoint in a browser, you would just get the very static HTML view of things. And the way you do that's a little slightly different. It's in the portal admin directory. You go create a new system property called disable services directory to true, and then that will disable that sharing REST API HTML view from users being able to browse it easily. Just a piece of information here. By default at 10.7, when you install the software, users will not be able to create new built-in accounts. So over here, although I have it checked on right now, it actually is checked off by default. So in this case, administrator would have to create user accounts in advance. But if you did want to turn that on, we just be very cautious. Realize that when you do enable that, then anyone that can get to your ArcGIS portal URL can actually go in and create an account and start to have access to content. So just be very cautious if you do decide to enable this feature. With CORS requests, again, same thing. You may want to limit, which web, the web applications or the URL, the domains that can make calls to the sharing API. So within the home app and organization settings here, you can actually add this to the allowed origins list of servers. So if you're deploying web apps, to a different domain than where your portal or your enterprise installation is, then you may need to, and you want to restrict that, you may need to go in here and add that web server domain to be able to make calls to your portal. Much like server, there is a portal scan tool that you run and interrogates your local installation and finds out information about vulnerabilities and whether it's critical, important, recommended, and then you can adjust accordingly. So real quick, I'm just going to open one of these links. This is the link to the portal scan tool. And if you go to this location, it actually lists all the things that it looks for, like proxy restrictions, token request, if the portal services directory is accessible or not. So it's pretty cool. It looks for a number of things in order to generate an output of ways to improve your posture. So if you don't know about this tool or haven't used it before, check it out. It's really nice. It's some a quick way to get improving your security framework of your installation. So that's going to kind of wrap up what we wanted to present today. A few key takeaways is just recall that SSL or TLS, it's about secure and encrypted communication using properly signed certificates from certificate authorities. It starts at the web tier, but can extend all the way down to the individual components, updating those certificates and making sure it has proper trust. Authentication tier depends on your organization and what level of system access that your users have, so that drives the type of authentication tier you need to implement. And then always follow best practices. We covered just a few here today, but we talk about many things in our doc when it comes to security. So follow best practices. Things we didn't talk about today is restricting ports between different server backends and things like that, for example, as well. So there's many in-depth things there from a security perspective you could take a look at. So Amy, I'm going to turn it back over to you for to close out the webinar, and maybe we can answer some questions that may have popped up.
All right, thank you, Bill. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. We've received some really good questions, and we'll try to get through as many as possible, but whatever we do not get to today, we will address in a GeoNet blog post after this webinar, should we not be able to get to all of them. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So our first question is, does Enterprise create the self-signed certificates during installation?
Yes, when you install the software, whether it be portal or server or data store, It generates self-signed certificates based on the host name. Yes, it does.
All right, perfect. Thank you. When you allow, this is the next question, when you allow automatic account creation, does that automatically give that user access to content that is shared with everyone, members of ArcGIS Enterprise, or both? And they're asking specifically about portal tier authentication, if there's a difference.
Yeah, I'll take that question, and the answer is yes. If you enable the automatic account creation, when the user signs in, the account will be created with a default role and user type, and they will then have access to any item that's shared with both everyone and a member of ArcGIS Enterprise, because since they've got an account, they are considered a new member of that. So the answer is yes.
All right, great, thanks. Next question. So if we want the single sign-on experience, we cannot have the built-in users, is that correct?
If I'll take that as well. If you're using the web tier authentication like I displayed in my demo, then yes, you would not be able to have built-in users. Now, one consideration to make if you do want to have something close to the single sign-on experience, but allow built-in users, is you can use SAML. You can configure, in my example with the SAML, the ADFS, I had to type in my username and password when I clicked on login with an enterprise user. You could easily configure SAML to be a single sign-on. So I click the enterprise logon, I get redirected, and for a brief second, you'd see the screen flash, and then I'd come back and I'd be logged in automatically. That would allow you to have a pseudo single sign-on experience, plus it would allow you to use built-in users.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. So you mentioned that you're not able to log out after setting up web tier authentication. Then how do you log in as an administrator?
That's another great question. Prior to setting up or enabling the web tier authentication on your web adapter, it's something I should have mentioned, I highly recommend that you have an enterprise user who is set up with the administrator role. And so you'd be able to log in as that user from a machine and be able to access and take care of administrative tasks accordingly. Now, worst case scenario, if you haven't done that, is you can still access your ArcGIS Enterprise site over port 7443. It's not necessarily, it's another way to get around the web adapter. Usually I would recommend having an enterprise user that's an administrator in that case.
All right, thanks. If we set up SAML authentication and ArcGIS Enterprises on premise, can external users access sites from the portal?
So yes, if you've got your SAML authentication configured, I guess the question is more, sounds like if the ArcGIS Enterprise site is accessible externally, then yes, external users would be able to access that, and you'd have the option to, they would log on as an ArcGIS account. You'd have to create individual accounts for those external users. That is making the assumption that the site is available externally, though.
All right. Is there a way to support more than one authentication method, such as IWA and enterprise identity?
In what the examples I gave, no, you could not combine the SAML and IWA. You would have to select, similar to what I talked about in the previous question. You could configure your SAML to authenticate with a single sign-on experience, and then allow the non-enterprise users, give them ArcGIS accounts and allow them to log in through that method. But there's not a way to combine the two.
All right. Do you see any issues with using self-signed internally only SSL securing the web adapter machine in the DMZ?
I'll let
Can
you
you
take that, Bill.
ask that again? Ask that again, Amy.
Sure. Do you see any issues with using self-signed internally only SSL securing the web adapter machine in the DMZ?
Jeff, you might have to help me on this one.
I guess
Would there? I guess it.
the only
I mean,
issue.
typically in a so typically, users are accessing a web server in the DMZ, and the DMZ is then, routing traffic potentially to, the internal network. I mean, for me, I would think that is where you actually want a properly signed certificate, is in the DMZ, because that's what your users are going to be interacting with. Am I thinking of that correctly? Or am I missing?
It sounds like they're asking if it's in the DMZ, the web adapter has the SSL certificate that's signed. Is it safe to leave the internal certificate self-signed?
For enterprise?
Using self-signed internally only. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the question.
I mean, typically, this is a rule of thumb that I suggest is, if you get good signed certificates at the web server tier, then there's no need to change the SSL certificates, the self-signed internal certificates on server and portal, unless security is making you, or there's some real reason why you need to change those. So typically, I suggest don't change those self-signed certificates. Make sure you have a good certificate at the web server, unless there's some valid or security reason that you need to make those changes.
Okay, I believe you did answer the user's question because that was what they were saying. So thank you. Okay. The next question, is there a way to enable REST services for certain users, or is it all or nothing?
Oh, Amy, are you?
Oh, sorry. Were you not able to hear me?
Yeah, my audio just went out. I don't know if that.
Okay, sorry. I'll repeat the question. Is there a way to enable REST services for certain users, or is it all or nothing?
For REST, it's all or nothing.
Yeah.
There's not a way to enable or disable for specific users.
Okay. Next question, is everyone and members of ArcGIS Enterprise essentially the same thing if you allow automatic account creation?
Not always. If you're using the portal tier authentication and they access your ArcGIS Enterprise site but do not sign in, then they could still go into maps and they could still go in and view content that's shared with everyone. They're not signed in yet. That's assuming that you have allowed anonymous access. There's another security setting within ArcGIS Enterprise to enable or disable anonymous access to your ArcGIS Enterprise. If anonymous access is enabled and you're using portal tier authentication and a user accesses the site but never logs in, then they only have access to what is shared with everyone.
Okay, great. And last question, if you're using web tier authentication, can you use it when creating new accounts in ArcGIS Portal?
If you, I assume that's asking if you enabled the automatic account creation, then yes. With web tier authentication enabled, any user that goes in and accesses the site, their account would be created automatically. And that's a consideration to keep in mind if you enable automatic account creation is how many licenses you have. If you expect a lot of users to be accessing your site, but you don't have enough licenses to support creating accounts for all of them, then it would be recommended to disable the automatic account creation and just have the administrator create the individual accounts that would be needed or that would need access to the ArcGIS Enterprise site.
All right. Well, thank you, Bill and Jeff, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Security Considerations for Web GIS. If you have any other questions, please feel free to contact me using my email address in your follow-up email. And once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. We will be providing a recording of this presentation, which will be available within 7 to 10 business days on the go.esri.com/geodev page. And on behalf of Esri and our presenters, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.